Given everything that we've looked at so far, asynchronous programming seems handy and is something that we really want to introduce in our applications, especially if we want to increase the user experience. Although sometimes the asynchronous operations might fail. We did talk about the fact that the await keyword is a way to validate that the asynchronous operations perform successfully. When we call getStockPrices, an error occurs. The await keyword makes sure that this is propagated back to the caller. This is why we can catch the exception and add a note to the user that something went wrong. Have you considered what happens if you simply remove the await keyword? You'll notice that nothing happens. The application behaves as if the stocks were loaded, but we can't see anything about a failure. This proves that if we don't use the await keyword, the exceptions will be swallowed. The exceptions will be swallowed by the task, which is referencing the ongoing operation. This task will be in a false state, with an attached exception. Without the await keyword validating that this task completed successfully, we don't know what happened. I also mentioned earlier that async void is something that you'd really want to avoid. Let me now show you why that is. When you mark a method as async, it will automatically return a task. Obviously, if that's what the method signature indicates. But if we mark the method as async void, while it compiles and runs, there's now a big difference in how it works. Run this without the debugger attached, then search for a non-existing company, and you'll see that the application just terminates. It totally crashed. Because what happened was that the exception that was thrown inside the method couldn't be set on a task. This means there's no task to swallow the exception, and the exception will be thrown back to the caller. This is problematic. Being great developers as we are, we simply try and catch this inside the click event handler. We might now expect the application to simply swallow the exception and do as it did before, and tell us that it loaded the stock and add a note to the user and not populate anything inside the data grid. It's still tearing down the application. The problem here is async void. Async void is really terrible. And if you use it, your applications may crash if there's an unhandled exception inside your asynchronous method. So how do we fix this? Well, an easy solution is for you to not write any code that causes exceptions. And you'll be totally fine. Although that's not really realistic. Let's revert the method signature back to async task. In the case of search click, this can't be anything but async void. Therefore, there are instead two things that we can do to ensure that exceptions are caught and handled. First, we need to await the asynchronous method call. Second, we should wrap the code in a try and catch block. As a side note, for methods like this that needs to be marked as async void, try and minimize the amount of code that could potentially fail. What we've done here is to make sure that no code inside our async void method can throw an exception. This will just minimize the risk of it being a problem. Ideally, we'd avoid using async void completely, but in this case, we just can't. Remember to always use the await keyword to validate that there's no exceptions in your asynchronous operations. We've got a better experience again when running the application. Searching for a non-existing stock immediately shows us that there's an error that occurred. Without the await keyword present, we wouldn't have been able to catch this exception in the method. If you have a long chain of asynchronous operations, you need to make sure that it's awaited somewhere. At this point, we don't want the call to be fired and forgotten. This would swallow potential exceptions, and we'll never know if there was a problem. I can't stress enough how important this is. Avoid using async void and always make sure that you await your asynchronous operations.